You're locked in, and I'm Algenon Cash. Welcome back. Got a really interesting discussion for you tonight. We're going to be talking about reforming police in America. I've got two guests for you. Antionette Kerr, who you may remember, came on several months back. She's the CEO of Bold and Bright Media, also a journalist and author, and she's going to talk about some of the lack of transparency inside of these police departments. And then we've got our old buddy back on with us tonight as well, Kwame Opata, who is a criminal defense attorney. And he's going to talk a little bit about some of his experiences interacting with police and some of these police brutality cases. And what really prompted me to want to do this conversation tonight is we recently had an incident here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where a 15-year-old had a really interesting confrontation with the police. It is something that the community at large is starting to watch and pay close attention to. I know that Chief Katrina Thompson has launched an internal investigation to find out exactly what happened on the night that this incident occurred. And for you all that may not know anything about her last name is Sides. She's a 15-year-old young lady. I do not know her first name. I'm not even sure if they've released her first name. But we do have a video. It's about a 3-minute video that we're going to use to sort of kick off this conversation. That you take a look at it. Can get a little bit graphic, some interesting sounds as well. Some of the images have been blurred out because obviously she is underage.
Tonight, 12 investigates a video that shows a tense interaction between Winston-Salem police officers and a teenager who ended up being arrested. Our Brandon Bates spoke with the teen girl's father, the woman who recorded the footage, and Winston-Salem police. He joins us in the studio this evening. All right, Brandon, what are they all saying?
Well, Kenny, we'll start. The teenager's dad is visibly upset 2 days after it happened, and police are now looking at videos to see what the next step needs to be. We have blurred out some faces here because most of the children here are under the age of 18. Take a look.
Be quiet.
I just told y'all to chill out today.
Saturday night around 6:30, 5 teenagers were walking down Hartford Street in Winston-Salem when officers approached them.
What's your name, man?
Why are you asking for my name?
I need everybody's information.
Because
I'm investigating a house break-in.
But it wasn't us.
Okay.
One of them was my daughter, and started asking them questions about who they were and where they were over there.
Winston-Salem police say they were investigating a report of several juveniles who were trying to break into a vacant house.
The girls were standing about where you are. The officer was here. I was here.
The whole situation unfolded in front of Peggy Dole's home, so she got her phone out and started recording this video.
I stepped out here and asked for the officer's name and badge number. He turned to me and told me that I needed to get out of the way. Officer, can I get your name and your badge number, please?
Because I have not done nothing.
This is my investigation.
This is my yard.
That officer can then be seen asking again for a specific teenager's name, and when she refused again, this happened.
Are you going to give me your name or not?
I could not protect her with my life. I could not protect her because I had no choice.
While the teenager was in handcuffs, her dad was at home. He eventually saw the video and his heart dropped.
I heard her screaming with these cops' knees in her back. I heard her screaming, please get off of me. I didn't do anything.
Listen to
Go get her.
Get your feet in the car.
No. Get in the car.
How could the other officers sit around and watch them take my child to the ground the way that they did?
Police say while detaining 2 teenagers, 1 juvenile resisted and another assaulted an officer. WXII spoke to Police Chief Katrina Thompson over the phone, and she released this statement. Quote, "It's been brought to my attention and the Professional Standards Division is conducting the administrative investigation into this entire incident," end quote.
This was a group of black teenagers walking through their own neighborhood, being stopped by a group of white officers, and of course they're going to be scared. They just watched a friend of theirs get tackled and laid face down on the pavement and put in handcuffs. Do you not understand, after everything that's happened over this past summer, after George Floyd, after everything that's come out, how could you not understand that they're terrified?
And while he still can't believe what happened, Ernest Sides says he's glad his daughter is physically okay, but knows this will haunt her mentally.
I'm trying my best to be calm, but every time I turn around, I look at my daughter, and I see that I could not protect her the way that I'm supposed to as a father.
And both teenagers who were arrested were released, and this case does remain open. Again, it is being investigated internally by the Winston-Salem Police Department to see if proper actions were taken by the officers. As for Ernest Sides Jr., he's not sure what his next step will be, but he wants something to be done and to be done soon. Reporting live in the studio, Kenny Baxter.
Well, it's tough because all right, so if you follow the logic of the officer, he's responding to a group of kids in a neighborhood breaking into a house. I imagine when he walks up to the scene, he sees a group of kids walking around in a neighborhood. I think the question we ask as a society, is it reasonable for an officer in that circumstance to talk or to stop and have a chat with those kids, right? Remembering that this is the reason why he was there in the first place, because it was a report about kids in a neighborhood. And so what I would want to know is just a few more facts before I go off the deep end on it. And then we can talk about maybe something more inclusive generally in America. Is you see the first little fella there, he's already cuffed and on the ground. By the time the video plays, you see that the children are kind of riled up in a manner which tells me that something may have happened to get that young boy cuffed and sitting on the ground first. And so now the situation is kind of spiraled out of control. And I think what a lot of people want is maybe techniques given to our officers in order to allow them, more ways in which to get an out of control situation into control, right? And so for me, I'm not one to just jump off and say, oh, this part was wrong. She could have done this, he could have done that, because there's so much more to talk about. And I think we're probably going to delve deep into it in this discussion. And so I'm actually pretty excited about it.
And Antoinette, I know you as Ann, so I'm going to take a little bit of license as a close friend to call you Ann. And what was your initial reaction when you watched that video?
A couple things. I noticed that even with a journalist, and coming from a journalist background, that a lot of times they use the term juvenile, and I think that says a lot. Words mean a lot. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth flows, right? So here in this language, this is a child, and this is someone's child. So I appreciate them interviewing Mr. Sides, but I think about the fact that this was someone's child. And if you see the use of force, do you believe, and not having seen the entire video, I agree with Kwame that, it's hard to jump to conclusions without being there and knowing all the facts. But, for me, the use of force, and the sheriff's department has admitted to that being a problem. Just on the 12th, they did a 31-page report about excessive use of force. And from what I saw from the video, this is a classic example of not knowing de-escalation tactics, and not knowing, or if you do, not using them. And, I feel like there was a rush of emotion at some point, if you watch the video, where you see that the officer seems to be agitated and frustrated. And then it seems like after that, an excessive use of force happens. And so I think that one of the big questions for me, not just to have, a concern for this child who had a knee in her back, and for the other young people with her, but, it just brought up a couple things for me that really speak to that reform that we're here about tonight.
And that's I was going to say, it's very interesting she said that, because I think that's the piece where a lot of people kind of get off track, right? So you have the initial stop, you have the initial conversation, but after that, as a society, do we want officers having young ladies of that age on the ground with a knee in her back if it's just a frivolous, maybe incident in which, I'm not even sure she would even do jail time, maybe a community service. Do we really want our officers with his knee in the back of a 14-year-old young lady, really under any circumstances? So I think that's interesting what she said. I like the way she said that.
When the chief of police came out and made an official statement regarding the incident, and keep in mind the officer himself is not on leave right now. He is on administrative duty, so he's not on patrol. I guess he's hugging a desk right now. You know, the chief certainly showed sympathy, I think, to the young lady involved as well as the family. But she also said that, you know, ultimately after watching the video, she wanted to remind residents that when the police ask you to do something, then you need to follow those directions. And that's sort of how she ended the press conference. And there was a reaction from the community simply because they felt like she was basically absolving the officer of any responsibility and simply stating that the young lady involved should have just complied. And it, you know, I am someone too who has also argued that point. But you know, it seems like when we get into these types of incidents, we get into this debate around comply or resist.
Right.
And Kwame, what would be your advice? I mean, if you deal in this every day, all day, if you're working with a client, if you're working with a defendant, what's your advice to them? Do they just comply and live to fight another day, or do they resist? What's the advice you would give someone?
Well, it's hard because it's really a complex situation, and as African Americans, we have such a complex history, right? And so, as hard as an American, given our Constitution, to just say comply, 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 when one of your first 10 rights in the Constitution is basically rights against unlawful arrest, right? And so that would lead a regular person knowing that to understand that you just don't have to comply to everything, right? Practically speaking, in order to avoid an escalation, you would want a citizen to comply, right? So practically speaking, in order to avoid getting shot or killed or having a knee in your back, you'll want to say comply. But it's tough, right? With those two almost, you know, directly controversy things where you have the Constitution on one hand, and then you have us wanting to just survive a police interaction on the other hand. And for me, so it's a real complex question and situation where, yes, as an attorney, I say comply. You don't comply with everything. You have the right to ask questions because that's what the Constitution demands, right? So, and I'll explain just a little bit more. So if you're in a situation where you're accused by an officer of doing something, your silence to that accusation and your complicity to possibly being arrested could possibly be seen as something that can work negatively against you on the charges, right? Because then you ask those questions, right? A normal person would have denied all this stuff. You see what I'm saying? And so for me, when you have embedded in the law, case law that would essentially punish you almost in a sense for complying and just going along with the accusations, it's tough to just say comply all the time. And so it's really complex. And then as you look out beyond just Winston-Salem and you see people storming state capitals and running in the streets and doing all the things other types of people are doing, it almost seems like for one group, compliance is key, but then for another group, they're almost being commanded to break the law. And so it's a tough, really complex question. It's very interesting. I'd love to see what you guys got to say about that.
You know, Ann, you live in Davidson County, and that's always been an interesting area. I can recall growing up when Gerald Heggie was the sheriff down in Davidson County, and it was always made very explicit to me and many of my Black friends to don't get caught in Davidson County, you know, after sundown. I guess it was one of those sundown towns we hear about. If this was your daughter, if this was your child, we often talk about the talk, right? The quote unquote talk that we have to have with Black little girls and Black little boys, more increasingly even, you know, obviously with Black little girls. What would you advise your child? I mean, do they comply? Do they resist? Do they stand up for their rights? What would be your advice?
Well, and I'll say that you know, officers went on the record to say that, you know, some pretty egregious stuff with our Sheriff Heggie, our past Sheriff Heggie, who has been convicted of several felonies. But he told officers to stop anyone darker than snow. So that was said over and over again in the court case, and it was eventually used in helping to indict Heggie. So growing up, we knew that, there's a trust issue, and within the communities, there's, I think in a lot of communities, there's a trust issue. So we get the talk, and a lot of us have had it, if you get stopped, comply, do everything you can. But I'll just give an example down in Robeson County, which is how I got into this conversation about police accountability. I started doing investigative reporting about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I was told by survivor after survivor that the police were known. And if you look up a case called Tarnished Badge in Robeson County, you'll see, but they were known for a lot of corruption, including stopping young women and forcing them to get into police cars. And what they have been accused of is having, acts that are inappropriate with them in the police cars. So if it's my daughter and I say comply, there has to always be a caveat of, you have the right, if something's not right, if it doesn't feel right, to voice, and you should voice your objection. In one case, an officer was, he was indicted by the SBI and FBI for having a felonious sexual assault while a 16-year-old was in his custody. So it's hard for me to hear that, it's always wrong on the victim or the survivor or the person who stopped, whether it's wrongfully stopped, Trayvon Martin, or whether it's, stopped because there was a case. And, we all have heard you fit the profile way too many times. I'm still suspect when someone says, well, you Black youth, you fit the profile. Of course they do. So, what do we do? What do we do with that? And I know we'll get into this, Algenon, you have other questions, but I think that one of the big things that I've discovered in doing research is this lack of open and public records and information. Immediately as a journalist, I'm like, what's that officer's history? What are the past complaints? Have they used excessive force in the past? Because we know in the case with George Floyd that this could have been prevented if any employer had done the amount of detailed work and research around his 19-year history. You would see that excessive force has been a problem. And so my question is this, is it the same with this officer? Not just this one incident, but what is the history of this officer? And I think it's interesting too, and I'll just leave it there because I know we have other questions, that we can always find out the background of the teen, the young person. We can always find out their criminal background, but we cannot, because North Carolina law protects it so tightly, we cannot find out the personal history of officers who are doing these things. And I just, as soon as I get the press release and it has, this person's drug history, their mental health history, I can find out everything about a victim and zero about the person that in some cases took a life. I think that's wrong.
Yeah, you mentioned something a moment ago I want to come back to. You said there was this lack of trust. And I do believe that there's always been sort of a deficit of trust in a lot of our institutions, especially when you look at Black America, looking back at law enforcement or a wide range of other institutions, government and so forth. But, it just seems like this lack of trust in the police department, especially from the Black community is just growing and exacerbating. And when you see a 15-year-old out there, you have to sort of ask yourself, as part of the reason that you see the reaction that you see from her, is it because of this lack of trust and the images that she's seen on social media, on her televisions, probably conversations that she's had with family members who've had interactions with the police, friends that have had interaction with the police. And I do think it's led to a deficit of trust, almost like a bankrupt bank account almost. I mean, it's just completely void and empty. And so I do think, part of what we got to do in our country when it comes to reforming the police department, we've got to find some innovative and creative way to rebuild that trust and make it so that, people feel comfortable interacting with the police department. And I think that would also cause people to be more open to the idea of complying with these officers' requests and commands. If you watch the video, I mean, I do hear, he makes it clear, I'm in the neighborhood investigating a house break-in. So he does pronounce why he's there. He is responding to a service call. So that means a neighbor that lives in that community as well actually called 911, and the police arrived to investigate. And so I think just if you look at it on legal grounds, the officer probably won't be disciplined, probably won't be reprimanded, because he's going to say, hey, I was responding to a service call. I made it very clear to this teenage girl what I was doing. She refused to comply. And then even when I attempted to place her in custody, she resisted. I think they even tried to charge her with assault on an officer as well, which I'm certain a lot of this Jim O'Neill, our district attorney, will most likely drop. But despite all that, despite all the legal grounds, it just feels like part of this young lady's reaction to me when you watch the video was just a lack of trust in why the police is even in her neighborhood. It's almost like she didn't even believe them. You know, like that's not really why you're here. You're in our neighborhood to harass us. And so I do think that's something that we got to address. I want to read a quick story to you guys, and I think this is going to speak to something else that Ann just talked about. This is a story out of New York in Rochester. Officer Joseph Ferrigno shot a black man from behind. Court records show the Rochester cop had drawn at least 23 misconduct complaints in nearly 9 years on the force. One came from a woman who said Ferrigno, a burly hockey player, slammed her to the ground and broke one of her ribs. Another was from a one-legged man dumped from his wheelchair at a bus stop and roughed up by Ferrigno and two other officers. Through it all, the Rochester Police Department and the Locust Club, which is their police union, stood by Ferrigno. By his own account, the officer never once was disciplined for using excessive force. And I think that speaks a little bit to what Ann was just talking about, where you've got the police and the police. And you know, if I was an airline pilot and I crashed 20 planes, then I would think that when I go to work at another airline, that might be taken into consideration as being a disqualification for me flying another plane. And so if I have 23 accusations or 23 complaints of excessive force, I mean, Kwame, how on earth do you still get a job in law enforcement?
And I think that speaks to a large issue, but just really quickly, because I definitely want to touch back on that compliance piece, because an additional problem in that is you can comply yourself into consenting to an illegal search, right? And so you can comply, and next thing you know, you've consented for them to search your car when they didn't even have probable cause to do the search. And so consenting is such a tough thing to tell clients to do. And I just want to very quickly touch on that. But yeah, man, you touched on a big, humongous piece of it, right? The officer gets there. He seemed actually very calm to me at the beginning, told her why he was there, asked her just simply for her name, told her why he wanted her name. And so that's why I said and this is where things get kind of off whack, right? Because one set of people don't understand why you just don't comply. The other group of people don't understand why you don't understand why we don't, right? Because these simple stops are turning into death events for a lot of people, where you're getting choked. You know, all kind of things are happening, and so there's a natural fear that she had. And as a society, we have to admit that she was justified in being scared, just as much as he was justified in being there and asking questions. Why? Because now you're looking at a situation where things are happening with officers using excessive force, and not only is nothing happening to the officers, but quite often they're being applauded for their actions. And if you are a young person seeing this, right, there's no possible way that you can expect a teenager to not cry out for their mom and dad for help, right? And so she might not have been scared. She might have been in a situation where, like, whoa, let me get my dad on the phone. I don't know what's about to happen. I need my parents here. It could have been something as simple as that. And so for me, if we could have slowed down that interaction, right, and maybe de-escalated it, we could have gotten to the bottom base of why she reacted in that visceral way she reacted. And then more importantly, you can kind of tell that something was going on before that, right? There was a young kid already under arrest. So we don't even know what situation happened where that boy got under arrest. Was there something that happened? Was there some kind of conflict that happened? What was the circumstances in which they went forward with an arrest of the young boy who was already on the ground when the video played?
And I don't know if anyone can confirm, but my understanding is that they were released without being charged, all the young people involved. And I did have a question, so Kwame, so now I'm asking because I think, what about the right to contact an attorney, before you're questioned by an officer? Or, I mean, do you not have the right to slow things down and say, I'd like to contact my attorney? And I know that, likely maybe they didn't have attorneys, maybe that wasn't relevant in that time, but just to me, in a situation, when are you able to evoke that right and not be assaulted?
And see, here's the crux of it, right? Because per the Constitution, there's certain things that's needed to do certain things, right? So what we call reasonable suspicion turns into probable cause. Probable cause is what you need to effectuate an arrest, right? So was it reasonable for the officers to stop and talk to those kids in the first place, right? I would say it probably was, right? Somebody reported kids in the neighborhood breaking into the house. He pulls up to the scene. He sees a group of kids, right? So that is your reasonable suspicion to stop and talk, right? Because without reasonable suspicion, they don't even have the right to do that. Well, I don't want to say right, but their duty is not to do that, right? So once that happened, then do your rights trigger in which you don't have to answer questions. That's where we are. And so at that point, a lot of people say comply so it doesn't escalate from there. So in other words, you're saying if I'm innocent, why wouldn't you talk? You see what I'm saying? But if you look at the Constitution, is if you're innocent, why do you have to talk, right? So it's almost like we're kind of talking past each other. So the compliance people basically skip the entire Constitution, right?
Yeah, so I'm thinking like for a 15-year-old, it's her responsibility to de-escalate, right? We're leaving it on the citizens to de-escalate. So
I want to
think about what people are saying. That's what they're saying, right? It's on us to, right?
I want to come back to something Kwame said, going back to this story that I just shared with you guys out of Rochester. So Rochester police officers have shot at least 44 people since 1970. Of those 44 people, 23 died, and at least a dozen officers involved in those shootings were recognized later that year for distinguished or excellent service. One even received a key to the city. And how do we reform these police departments when there's no transparency? There's no there's no recourse for misconduct, and largely to some degree, you've got police unions that stand in the way of these reforms. How do we ever get to a better place?
I want to say just a couple things. Emancipate NC, I just can't get away from the work that they're doing. And if people were really interested in more about reform, they're really the experts in this area. I just happened upon some roadblocks and started talking to other journalists and family members of survivors. And I was appalled by what I found out. North Carolina has a D rating for public access and public information. It's one of, I think, 23 states that protects police personnel records to a high level. And I don't know if you all remember, it was Senate Bill 168 that a little more than a month after the George Floyd murder, they tried to sneak into a healthcare bill protection that someone who died in the custody of law enforcement, this happened at 2:30 a.m., but that someone who dies in protection of law enforcement, their informations cannot be public and their records cannot be made public. And so when you think about the fact that we're not only protecting people who are, violating, public information belongs to the public. When I go to police departments, I have, some level of confidence that this is our information. I shouldn't have to beg for it. I shouldn't have to come back tomorrow. I will be back tomorrow. But, that's what people don't understand, is that we are being kept away from information that's essential. So I say all that to say that I think some of the best things in reform, I love, and just to say something great about police Chief Williams in Wilmington, after 3 officers were heard making comments about inciting a race war on their, police car conversations, and through a routine investigation, it was discovered the police unit there tried to protect, and I don't know if they call it unions because I know that's an issue in North Carolina, but the law enforcement group tried to keep that information away from the public. And it went to a judge who allowed the chief to make the decision about whether or not to release that transcript. If you read that transcript, if anybody's out there and doesn't understand about trust, if you read that transcript, it reminded me of, 1990s with Gerald Hagee in Davidson County. So that I just wanted to say that, I have to commend him. I think it was maybe his first day on the job. He's pretty new in his role, but that is the level. And he said, we have to do this for public confidence. We have to let people know that we don't stand for this and that we will not hide this and protect this. And I thought, that went a long way. But there's also a report, and I talked about it before, the 12th, I think the Sheriff's Association put out a 31-page report. I know that advocates are frustrated because it still doesn't call for police review boards, like citizen review boards like you have in Winston-Salem. And I don't know, I'd love to hear how that's working, because I know that's a real big push for a lot of people, just to get. SBI has investigated the shootings of 468 officers since 2010 and haven't found that any of them were unnecessary. And that's what I think Emancipating NC and some other organizations are really saying, that the failure of police to do internal investigations, or the SBI to do internal investigations, is not good enough anymore.
Yeah, what I'm finding, I'll tell you, the Citizens Review Board that we have here in Winston-Salem, it doesn't have a lot of teeth in it. I don't want to say it's ceremonial. I mean, they obviously do good work and they review cases, but the Police Benevolent Association, which would be the forum, our police union, they have worked overtime to make sure that these citizen review boards really don't have a lot of teeth and really can't go after officers. So, and I understand the argument there. I mean, you get on a slippery slope if all of a sudden citizens can just, crucify an officer for every little thing he does. But, in order for us to get more transparency into the process, I think it's an important reform that we need to look at. And to your point, I think these police chiefs a lot of times are coming into these agencies and wanting to clean house. Again, what I'm starting to learn, it's the actual police unions and the way these employment contracts are negotiated and the recourse that's outlined in the contract as it relates to misconduct. It really ties the hands of the police chief in terms of being able to get rid of bad apples. And then it also ties the hands of the actual city councils or the elected officials who are actually responsible for managing these cities. They can't do the restructuring and the reforms they want because they've been pigeonholed into these really aggressive employment contracts. And so, it just seems like we've got a really a large institution here that needs to be not dismantled and not defunded, which is what people have talked about, but certainly restructured. And I think my good friend Derwin Montgomery, who may be listening tonight, he uses the word reimagine. And I really like that word, that we need to reimagine the way we approach public safety and law enforcement here, which may mean that, we've got to figure out a way for the police not to police themselves. That needs to be done, not internally, but externally. We certainly, if you go back to the video of the 15-year-old, I think some training around communication, de-escalation, maybe not always jumping towards using lethal force in all these incidents. So, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of training that needs to be done. There's some statutes that need to be restructured, policies that need to be looked at. Before we get off, before we wrap up tonight, knowing how large the challenge is, I'd love to hear from you guys. Just one more reaction. What's the best starting place, Kwame? I mean, it's a big challenge, a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables. People even talk about maybe even trying to reform how we approach low-level offenses like possession of marijuana to prevent the police from over-policing a lot of these Black and brown neighborhoods. What's one place we could start that would have a great impact based on your perspective?
From my perspective, I look back to the Ferguson report, if you remember, when they talk about policing for profit, right? And what that means is the ability of state and local governments to use the money that they get from criminals and criminal offenses in order to actually just have a budget. If you look closely at at some of these counties, you're talking about maybe 60 to 70% of their entire budget for their municipality is from criminality and the court system. And so what you get into a situation is if you put forth a budget with 70% of projected money coming from the court, then what does that mean, right? That means that some of our officers have to go out and find some money. you know what I mean?
There's an economic incentive.
There you go. And so that, to me, if I'm being honest with you, that's really the basis of all of our problems here in our country. I think we need to start there. But I do just want to say that because our officers are heroes. I mean, let's just be honest here, man. When you hear gunshots, when you hear bombs, they're the ones running to those sounds. We're the ones running away from them. And so I think it's always important for our officers to know, especially when they're listening and we're talking about this, because I know it all seems negative, that we love you guys, man. We appreciate you. And hell, we would not even function as a society without you. But it's the 5%, 1% in Guilford County, because we're the best. But it's that 5% of bad cops out there doing these things that ruins it for everyone. And nobody's talking about defunding, but crazy people. What we're talking about is providing funds for training, getting feedback from officers on how we can help them better do their jobs. And these are the things I think most people are talking about, because the last thing any of us want is a society where actual criminals are running around doing whatever they want to do unchecked. So it's always important for cops to understand how much we appreciate them and how much we love these guys and for the sacrifices they're making, but nobody's perfect. So I think we can recognize both. And I think most officers that I talk to do.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because we do want, and I've got some police officers, law enforcement agents that are part of my audience, and if you're listening, we do want you to know that we respect you, we appreciate you, but we also want to get to a point where we are not constantly inundated on our small and large screens of these incidents, the misconduct, the excessive force. George Floyd, at least for me, was really a breaking point. I mean, there's just no way you can watch that 8 minutes and 46 seconds and not walk away feeling like something significant needs to be done. And I'll push back only on one thing you said, Kwame. You said you said that they can't be perfect, but I think some jobs you got to be perfect, right? Like if I'm an airline pilot, I got to be perfect, man. Like I can't have a bad day. If I'm a brain surgeon, I gotta be perfect. I just I can't be off one day, Right. And I think that police is one of those serious jobs where when you're not perfect, when you don't get it right, somebody loses their life. You think about Breonna Taylor. I mean, you think about all these incidents that we've heard about. And quite frankly, we all know the advent of social media has really brought this more closer to us. But I mean, we're all old enough to remember Rodney King. No way you could watch that video and not think we got a serious issue that we need to deal with. So Ann, what I know you've written about this. What's that one area that you think we need to be focused on to move in the right direction?
Well, I don't think there's one. I think the funding conversation has come up a lot. I like this whole thing. Like, I'll be calling you, Kwame, about this whole cash for profit. I love what Satana DeBerry has done down in Durham with cash bail system, and also, kind of going back through, some minor drug offenses and really looking, because they were letting people out of jail during COVID, and a lot of the folks they were letting out were not Black and brown people. So that was a whole other issue too, not in Durham, but across the state. But for me, I think you approach it from different angles. I think I appreciate the person filming the Sides incident, and I had her name written down. I think it might be Peggy, but we need more of that. That's how things are changing. If people didn't see George Floyd, where would we be right now? If we couldn't even have this conversation without someone saying you're disrespecting police officers, and that is not what this is about. So I don't even like to spend time apologizing. But I do think that sunshine laws in North Carolina need to change. We need more accountability, and we need more citizen review boards. I think that, there's a case to see why, just from the little stats that we've talked about, why we should not expect police to just keep that, and it builds public trust to have these review boards, and they need to have teeth. I heard you before, Algenon, with that. So I think the more accountability, the more trust there is. I feel like everybody wants that. Everybody wants the trust to be there and to move past what we're seeing on our screens, the bad stuff that we're seeing on our screens. So I think we're not going to be able to get there without a serious reform in how information is shared, reported, presented, and how changes are made. What changes are being made?
I really appreciate you all locking in and having this conversation with me. When I saw that video, it was just something that I wanted to talk a lot more about. I'll be honest with you, as I mentioned a moment ago, I think George Floyd was sort of a breaking point for me. And so this year, I've even become someone that's paid a lot more closer attention to these issues. Kwame, I appreciate your comments around the comply component, because I know that tends to be a argument that I pivot to a lot, but you raised some really good points about the Constitution and some things that I need to sort of look at and think through again. If you've been listening to us tonight, you've been locked in. Kwame Opata is a criminal defense attorney here in town. So if you do have an interaction with the police, you can give Kwame a call, and he does good work, and certainly could help you navigate the process. You practice all over North Carolina, but I know you spend most of your time in Guilford and Forsyth, correct?
Guilford, Forsyth, Randolph lately. Yeah, I'm everywhere.
All over. Okay. So, and then you've also been listening to Antionette Kerr as well. She's the CEO of Bold and Bright Media. And I know you have written about this subject. Where can my audience go find some of your stuff?
You can find stories at Scalawag online. You can do a search for Scalawag Magazine. I think it's scalawagmag.com. And also, I'm a co-director for a storytelling initiative called Women Advance NC. So it's womenadvancenc.org, and you can see some stories there. Just do a search for my name.
Tomorrow, make sure you lock in with me tomorrow. I've got Garrett Holloway. Garrett Holloway is a city councilman down in Lexington. He's also a community leader, community activist, and young brother too. Someone I just started to get to know mostly this year. So Garrett's going to lock in with me tomorrow. We're going to have a conversation about what's going on out in the community, what response Lexington is doing for COVID-19, and I'm missing the barbecue festival, so I'm a little frustrated about that. But Garrett's going to be locking in with me. And next week, I've got the Guilford County Public Health Director will be joining me and locking in to talk about some of the county's changes in terms of how they're going to be enforcing the COVID restrictions that have been put in place by Governor Roy Cooper. So we'll have her. Dr. Van will be on with us next week, so you don't want to miss that as well. If you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel, go find us on YouTube. Just search Algenon Cash, subscribe to the channel. We've got new content going up there every day. Obviously, if you have friends that you think would enjoy this conversation, tell them to go like the page on Facebook. We've got new content coming out daily on the Facebook Live page, as well as Instagram. And I'm getting really, really close to launching my podcast, or relaunching my podcast. I actually had one many years ago, stopped doing it, but we are probably just about 2 weeks away from launching the Locked In podcast. And you'll be able to download that and access that on Apple iTunes, Spotify, Truth Podcast Network, and many other places. So until next time, y'all stay locked in.
Appreciate you.
Awesome, man.